The UN only has not its own interest at heart. It works for the world. It works for the people. Thank you very much, Madam President, and also for inviting me here tonight. I want you to know that I have spent 37 years in this organization that this House has no confidence in, the United Nations. And I had 15 jobs there. I was introduced with 2 of them. And I want to make something very, very clear. When the United Nations was founded 78 years ago, it was with a vision of peace, because the Second World War was the defining principle of the day. And what has happened is, in the 78 years, is we are no longer living in 1945. We're no longer living in 1950, but we're living now in a world that is 70 years later in 2024, and the world has changed a great deal. And the United Nations has changed with that world. It has adapted to that world, and I think that that is something that is extremely positive. Because what still is aware, however, is that the view of the United Nations is still dominated by the peace and security issues. I think it was called by a previous speaker, it was called the core mission. And yes, it is, but it has developed into so much more, and that's what we should be grateful for, that it actually exists as it is. The organization denied there are new entities that were created, and these entities were created in addressing challenges that were existing, not in 1945, but that came much, much later. But you have a much more diverse world now. You have much more threats that the world faces now, more conflicts, and not only more conflicts, but it faces also the climate change has been mentioned. It has zoonotic diseases, migration issues, economic insecurity. You have deepening inequalities, and it also has digital vulnerabilities. It now has disinformation, fake news, misinformation. Where do we take all of this? Is it only dealt with by individual states? But you also have, and let me underline that, you have a huge body of international treaties. Several of them have already been mentioned here. And what does it mean? I think it's like 600 treaties that have been developed and have been agreed on and have been ratified by member states. And that is a system where you can actually hold member states to account. And yes, the Genocide Convention is one of them. And that means that you can actually hold states to account. And so Jeffrey, my previous speaker, already mentioned the tribunal, and also on Myanmar, for example. And that basically means it's not ideal. Maybe we don't always get what we want, but we know exactly what is happening. And what is also happening is that some member states are saying, fine, maybe it's better to take over a state. I think we've seen what's happened in Libya. We've seen what's happened in Iraq. We've seen what's happened in Syria. That is not always a desirable outcome. So maybe at one point it was said when the UN was also created, it's better to jaw, meaning to talk, rather than war. War is not always the answer to the problems that we have. Now, what you have with the Genocide Convention, I wanted to just mention that, you also have something that is called the responsibility to protect. And that was something that came out of Secretary General Kofi Annan, and that was actually a very, very good thought to basically make the world better. And that meant that if you are a government, you have a responsibility of the government to protect the people in your country. That never really took off to a tremendous extent, because it meant that there were so many responsibilities that basically it was impossible for states to really fulfill. But what you have here, and that is something that has also been mentioned, is the humanitarian assistance has been very, very instrumental. You have, I think, something like 404 million people in 2023 that were helped by the UN in 83 countries. That is not something that can be done by individual states. That is not something that can be done by regional states, but it is something that is an international community. The United Nations is very, very strong on this. And you also have people who are willing to serve in countries that are not exactly the garden spots of this earth. Let's be honest. How many of you have visited some of the countries that are in very dire straits? You have United Nations staff members going there, very often at high risk, under very difficult circumstances. I myself have served in peacekeeping operations. I've been twice stationed to Africa. I've lived in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Ethiopia, in Eritrea. Those are not easy places to be. And you do it because you basically feel that this is something you really need to do. Someone needs to do it. Who's going to do it if it's not the United Nations? And I think that we need to keep in mind. Now, we also have increasing transnational risks, and conflicts do not carry passports. Problems do not carry passports. I've mentioned already some of them, and we've seen a very vivid example of that, for example, with the pandemic. You know, who's going to actually address this? They do not respect borders. The challenges are all interconnected. And I think the pandemic, and particularly the climate change, has brought this all home to us in a tremendous, tremendous state. And so what you have, the collective future that we are having, really hinges on international cooperation and effective cooperation. I want to mention something that's particularly relevant here also in the United Kingdom, and that is you have a very recent addition to the international agenda, and that's artificial intelligence. Who brought artificial intelligence to the United Nations? The United Kingdom. The first meeting they had in the Security Council was in July last year under the UK presidency. That was very meaningful. It was noticed. It was taken charge of. I mean, it was basically like, okay, does the Security Council deal with artificial intelligence? No, but it meant we're putting it on the international agenda. We need to deal with this issue. Secretary General Guterres, he had a body that was established late last year. It has international experts. Are they going to regulate artificial intelligence? I don't believe so they do. But what it means is that you have countries that are not greatly capable in artificial intelligence matters, but they want to have a seat at the table to know what's going on, what's happening, how does it affect us, what are the geopolitical issues that we need to discuss. This is something that no government, that no regional corporation can do, but it has to be multilateral, it has to be international, and that is really important. Governments, very often, as we know, are distracted. You know, they basically don't have long-term vision in mind. Maybe they have domestic challenges. They are dealing with foreign aggression. But on the other hand, the governments also must say they may be thinking short-term, the duration of the time in office. And so what the UN does is it's thinking long-term. It was mentioned already by a previous speaker that basically what you had is you had the climate issues were really pushed by the United Nations, needed to be addressed, and therefore it was. So the UN thinks long-term. What are the problems for the future? What is coming up? Like AI, which I mentioned already. And then also, what do we need to do today to improve the lives of others of the world in the future, 20 years from now? You had a water conference last year. Maybe it didn't really cause a lot of news, but it was an extremely important topic because water is becoming very scarce in many parts of the world. And that means that there are other problems that are stemming from it, like migration, like hunger, etc. So I think that we need to look at that. And also the Secretary General is planning a summit for the future for 2024. And also when you think about what is happening in the world is you have the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm sure you've heard of those. They were supposed to be making tremendous progress by 2030. It will not happen because of the pandemic, because of the situation we have now, fighting more than one war. But on the other hand, it provides a blueprint for the future, for the development of other countries, and also to basically give you a system of monitoring to see what's actually happening. How can we do this? And the monitoring, I think, is extremely important. And the previous speaker mentioned already Syria. And let me just sort of say that Syria, maybe we should be lucky that the Syrian representative at the United Nations asked the Secretary General to have an investigation of what was happening. He claimed there was an attack against his own troops. I had the privilege to lead that investigation. Going to Syria in a war zone, basically being threatened by a possible US attack at the time, is not really an easy matter. But on the other hand, what we have is we had Syria agreeing to join the Convention on Chemical Weapons. The chemical weapons were taken out of Syria. And until today, Syria is still being monitored in the Security Council as to what's happening there. And that is something that we should never forget, that this monitoring system, that maybe there are other areas where the United Nations is seen not to be cooperating, and I take that criticism, but on the other hand, we should never forget the very many good things, not only in the humanitarian assistance development side, but also in the political side, and I can give some more. Despite the failings, the opinion poll last year was conducted in 24 countries, and it showed that 63% of the people in these 24 countries agreed with the United Nations, and they wanted to see it continue. They wanted to see even more doing work, and they see it in a positive light. 28% saw it negatively. But on the other hand, the majority of the public has a positive opinion, particularly with respect to promoting human rights, economic development, and humanitarian assistance. I think that the world is too fragile, particularly now, to spend time on political bickering. We should really concentrate on what is it that we need? What is it that we need to have a future that is positive? And the UN only has not its own interest at heart. It works for the world, it works for the people. And that is something, it works for all of us, the peoples of the world. And therefore, I ask you to vote no to the motion and keep the UN functioning. Thank you.